Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
Welcome to this encore segment of St. Louis on the Air. I'm Sarah Fensky. A new book reframes American history so that St. Louis sits at the center. It's the work of Harvard University historian Walter Johnson. The book presents a big change in how American history is told. No more looking at the nation as if it's that New Yorker cartoon where everything important happened in New York or LA, and the vast middle was mere flyover country. In Walter Johnson's telling, the St. Louis story is the American story. That story is messy and ugly. In Johnson's telling, it's a story of white supremacy, of European Americans building an empire on the backs of everyone else, and the violent conflicts that result when the people they marginalize fight back. The book is called The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the United States. I talked with Walter Johnson in May. I first noted that he grew up in Columbia, Missouri, but hasn't lived here for years. I asked him why he decided to put St. Louis under his lens.
Well, it really had to do with the fall of 2014 and almost accidental set of events. I had been invited to WashU to give a keynote address for our graduate student conference, and the invitation probably came at the end of 2013, but it was for October of 2014. It was for the weekend that turned out to be Ferguson October. And so I really felt like, given the fact that I am a Missourian, and given the fact of the sorts of things I'm interested in and the way that I think, I really felt called to try to come and talk about some of what was going on in historical perspective. And that took it was a quick learning curve for me. I had to set aside things that I had some experience in studying and learn about a new set of things. I started off that fall with a piece about the political economy of Ferguson and the political economy of tax abatement in the county and in the city, and particularly the question of Emerson Electric, a Fortune 500 company in the city limits of Ferguson. And a simple question, kind of a naive question, which is, how could it be that the city of Ferguson was farming poor black motorists for traffic tickets when there was a $26 billion a year corporation in the city limits? And so from there, I just sort of went backwards. I'm a 19th century historian, so I guess I went backwards to begin going forwards again.
And in your book, you get at not just systemic racism, but structural racism.
Right.
For those who aren't experts in this, help us understand what that difference is.
Yeah, what I'm trying to do in the book is to write a long history of what I would call structural racism. And I think a lot of people use the term structural racism to mean really, really bad racism or really recalcitrant racism. And I'm trying to use it somewhat differently. I'm trying to talk about forms of exploitation, domination, and racial hierarchy that are actually built into the fabric of our lives. Like the interstate highway system, for instance, or the divide between the city and county, or the multiplicity of the municipalities. And the idea is to illuminate historically the way that these things came to be. And so to help us see, I was initially trying to help myself see how it is that attitudinal racism, believing that some groups of people are inferior to others, is structured into the landscape in a way that it produces a kind of an alibi, right? That at some point it becomes possible for racial hierarchy to go forward without anybody actually expressing any racist ideas, because it's so structured into our daily lives.
It's such an ugly story in so many ways. And your book, I really enjoyed it. I learned so much. It also infuriated me at so many points. And at other points, I just felt so deeply depressed. Do you think any city would fare this badly under your microscope? Or do you think the St. Louis story really is uniquely and particularly dark?
I guess I almost feel called to start the answer to that question by saying I love St. Louis. And I feel like the book is also full of heroes. And so I do want to emphasize that. My view of St. Louis is that it is not unique at all in the United States, but that it may be exemplary. And so what I mean by that is that I think the things that I really do believe, and I really have tried to capture the way that I believe that the history of the United States was made, was articulated, was best expressed and first expressed in St. Louis. But it's still the history of the United States, and so I don't think that the history of Indian killing and Indian removal, or of the sorts of anti-blackness that I describe, or of urban renewal, are unique to St. Louis. I do think that they were, in many cases, extremely expressed in St. Louis. So I think the way that I generally answer that question is not by saying St. Louis is unique, but by saying it is extreme.
I was struck by your exploration of slavery in St. Louis. You wrote that it was, quote, uniquely violent because it was uniquely precarious.
Right.
What do you mean by that? What made slavery so precarious here?
Well, I have, the most of my career has been devoted to the study of slavery, and most of the work that I've done on slavery has been in the Deep South. And one of the things that's struck me about slavery in the Deep South is that it is an economic institution and a racial institution and a social institution, but it's also a spatial institution. One of the things that is very, very terrifying about slavery in Mississippi or Louisiana to enslaved people is that it's very difficult to escape. It's just a long way from any sort of safety. That wasn't the case in St. Louis. Right. In St. Louis, it was not it's very comparatively easy to escape.
Illinois was right across the river.
Right. And what that means then is that the boundary between slavery and freedom is maintained by a more overt sorts of daily violence. Some of the violence of slavery, and I've written another 500-page book about the intense violence of slavery in the Deep South. So I don't want to be misunderstood, but some of that is expressed spatially through the landscape itself, and that's just not the case in St. Louis. The other thing is that there's a very, very unclear understanding in St. Louis, as there is in a lot of the urban South. It's just not clear who's free and who's enslaved at any given moment. There are a considerable number of free people of color in St. Louis in the 19th century. There are even more free people of color who work on riverboats going up and down the Mississippi to New Orleans, but also up the Missouri into Indian country. And so there's just a lot of uncertainty, and I think uncertainty in hierarchical and unstable political situations is often resolved through violence.
Yeah, and it was fascinating reading about how that confusion between who's slave and who's free led to so many terrible policies and so many bad court decisions. That it was just fascinating to look at it through that lens. One of the other things that was so surprising and striking to me in this book, I think in St. Louis we grapple a lot with the history of slavery, knowing that the slave auction house was here in the Dred Scott case. I don't know that we talk much about the city's role in clearing Native Americans out of the West. And this was a guy who's regarded as a local hero, William Clark, whose role you really explore in here.
Yeah, I do think that, and I think the thing that struck me the most as I wrote the book was the connection between the history of empire and the history of anti-blackness. And that begins with St. Louis's role as an imperial city. And I, starting out, had no idea of the military importance of St. Louis in the 19th century, but Jefferson Barracks was the headquarters of the Western Department of the Army for most of the 19th century. And most of the Indian wars before the Civil War were staged out of Jefferson Barracks. And for a time, after the Civil War, William Tecumseh Sherman moved the entire headquarters of the U.S. Army to Jefferson Barracks. And so that history of Indian removal, which does begin with Clark, who was, it antedates Clark, but Clark was the chief Indian agent of the United States of America for a period for the 1810s, 20s, and into the 30s, and oversaw the removal of at least 80, maybe 100,000 people from the states east of Missouri. And then the Indian removal, only increased after that, and it became increasingly characterized by open war through the 1830s, really through the 1880s, and many of those wars were staged out of, as I said, out of Jefferson Barracks, and many of the people who became the heroes of the Civil War were Indian fighters before they were Civil War generals.
We're listening to my conversation with historian Walter Johnson from May. He's the author of The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the United States. More in just a moment. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
Now back to my conversation from May with historian and Missouri native Walter Johnson. He's the author of The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the United States. One of the other things in this book that was just eye-opening to me was learning about the World's Fair from the perspective that you brought to it. In the city of St. Louis, we may think of this as our moment in the sun. You see a lot of ugliness there and did a good job of explaining it. You call it a sanitized and idealized projection of the self-regarding fantasy life of the city's ruling class. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, I see the World's Fair was in many ways the epitome, the apogee of the expression of the United States empire of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And I think that by that time, the way that national and regional leaders are thinking about empires is a kind of a tutelage, as a sort of a school for the less able people of the world. And the idea is to help everyone find their appropriate place in the greater scheme of Anglo-Saxon dominance. And so the World's Fair is staged as a kind of a series of lessons about the limited improvability of the peoples of the world if properly exposed to the generous tutelage of Anglo-Saxons. And I think for the leaders of the city, who the patrons of the fair, David Francis, most emblematically, it serves as an opportunity for them to try to educate working class and even poor white people about to make a pitch to them. And that pitch is, why don't you join us in at the top of the pyramid? Why don't you come and play your part too? And we can help lift you above everyone in the world if you stop going on strike, if you stop creating all of this difficulty, if you stop thinking about the central antagonism in the society as being between capital and labor, and instead you think about the way that all of us here in Forest Park or St. Louis or the United States of America are at the top of the pyramid of civilization.
Now, you mentioned these workers going on strike, and really, if there's light in all of this darkness that you're exposing in this book, you find it in some wonderful people who really pushed back. There's such a long history of dissent here. You write that the sit-in movement actually began in St. Louis all the way back in 1941. How were we so far ahead of what was happening in the 50s and 60s elsewhere?
I think that one of the things that struck me as I wrote the book was the long and enduring history of labor and black radicalism in the city of St. Louis, dating back to the general strike in 1877. I think that the sit-in movement is, even after what I've done, and certainly what Keona Irvin has done in her wonderful book, there's still room for more work on the sit-in movement. And I think that it is one of the things about black activism in St. Louis is that from a very early moment it was economically focused. It was economically focused partly because African Americans could vote in St. Louis already, and so there was not the huge struggle around voting rights that there was in many other places in the nation. But it was also economically focused because there was a very large and enduring legacy left over from the economic actions taken by black women and communists in the 1930s. And so there were terrifically interesting alliances between black working people and the Communist Party in St. Louis in the 1930s. And I think that focus on economics, on employment, on fairness in access to different sorts of consumer goods, all of those things are very, very strong in St. Louis. I would say as strong as anywhere in the nation, and stronger than in many places. And I think that the sit-in movement is emblematic of that. And they were successful, right? The downtown lunch counters by the 50s were integrated. That there was no even before the city passed a public accommodation law, the protesters had succeeded in the downtown department stores.
And you say they succeeded even though the daily newspapers just seemed determined not to cover this. It made me wonder, looking back as you looked at these archives of St. Louis newspapers, if journalism has more to be ashamed of here than necessarily to be proud of.
Well, I think that the St. Louis Globe Democrat had a long and proud history as a voice for the far right in the United States of America.
I mean, you placed Pat Buchanan there writing editorials for them.
Yeah, right. So, no, Pat Buchanan's editorials, and I do think that Buchanan sort of cut his intellectual teeth in St. Louis amongst, several other people on the right or far right. And so that's another part of the history that's a part of the history that I had in some way known just from growing up in Missouri and hearing some of, just hearing my parents talk about the John Birch Society or the Globe Democrat or Buchanan, that I had some kind of knowledge of that I had forgotten from my childhood. But it was really interesting to uncover the importance of St. Louis in the kind of history, intellectual history of racial nationalism that I think we've all become a little bit more interested in recently.
That leads me right to one section of the book I did want to ask you about. And you talk about how these reactionaries and even Nazis were fighting to keep black kids out of swimming pools and neighborhoods. But you write, not all the people in St. Louis or the county were like Phyllis Schlafly or John Stormer or Pat Buchanan. Far from it. Many whites in the St. Louis suburbs during those years probably grew up in the way I did, living 2 hours west. They believed in, quote, good schools, nice neighborhoods, and high property values, and disidentified, if not always openly openly, or still less courageously, with the overt racism of some of their neighbors. And that served them, as it did me, as an alibi for failing to connect the dots between their own privileged lives and the white supremacists out on parole in the perimeter of their towns. This was one of the only personal notes throughout this entire 500-page book. It made me wonder about you. When did you first begin to understand how much you'd benefited from all of this privilege and white supremacy that you focus on in this book?
Yeah, well, I appreciate you point to that, because in a way that's the moral center of the book. And it is, as much as I think people will read it and think that I'm trying to, roll in from Harvard and scold everybody like some kind of abolitionist avenging angel. Really, the moral center of the book is my own perplexity in my childhood at certain things that I saw and did not understand. And also at certain, I hold myself responsible for not having understood for much of my life what the parameters of my imagination, my political and moral imagination were. And so, so really it's an excavation of that. Schools in Columbia where I went were not segregated, except for on the inside. And so, there's the schools were tracked, and I think that I benefited a lot, along with a lot of white Midwesterners, from the sort of what used to be the diversity-focused politics of colleges and universities, private colleges and universities in the East Coast, which was the geographical diversity admission.
You get to be the kid from Missouri.
I was the kid from Missouri. Yes, I was, in more ways than one. And so, I think honestly, just to be really foursquare honest about it, I think that there is, even within the academy today, I as a white man, there's a certain rhetorical stance that I can adopt without people getting too bent out of shape, right? So a lot of my rhetoric is pretty hot, and I feel pretty hot about things. But there's a way that there are certain people who can hear that coming from me in a way that they might not be able to hear that coming from somebody else. And so, and I mean, it's not like I don't get hate mail too, but I think that's a contradiction. That's a perplexity of my existence, and I am, after all, a white man who works at Harvard University, and so it would be really, really outrageous for me not to imagine that the framing parameters of my endeavor have to do with my own lucky life.
We got an email from a reader who has already read and finished your book, and he says it's excellent. He did have a question for you, though. He noted that St. Louis City elected Kim Gardner, a black woman prosecuting attorney, and the county defeated Bob McCullough and elected Wesley Bell. Both were elected with significant white support. Perhaps the ghost of Thomas Hart Benton is not as strong in current times, Tom writes. He says the book is excellent, but it would be better if he had addressed that. Why end with Michael Brown? Why not get into some of the political change that followed his death?
That's a terrific question, and a lot of it has to do, honestly, with a lot of it has to do with the timeline on which books are written. And so you have to imagine this as being a book that I finished really writing a year ago. And that's not a sufficient answer, because both Gardner and Bell were elected before that. I do try to finish with a set of images of people in St. Louis who I think are doing amazing revolutionary work. And so I think it's a fair question of why not to imagine a historical sea change. I think, honestly, that the moment I was finishing the book was the moment of Better Together, and then the Stenger.
So there was still some ugliness going on as you were wrapping this up.
And so I was very conscious also of not trying to capture that, to say to some sort of gesture of "See, I told you so," because I actually see in the city of St. Louis, a lot of really, really visionary work that people are doing. I see people doing, creating what I imagine to be sort of fragments of a better future. And so the epilogue is devoted to several of those beautiful, smaller, but I think morally and practically really consequential projects in St. Louis.
And that's actually the perfect note for us to end this conversation on. So, Walter Johnson, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
No, I appreciate it, and I loved your introduction. I'm grateful to you for having me on and for having read the book so closely.
Walter Johnson is the author of The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the United States. I spoke with him in May. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.